Shannan Gilbert's disappearance, and the beginning of a nightmare. On the morning of May 1, 2010, 24-year-old Shannan Gilbert vanished in Oak Beach, New York. To the outside world, she was another young woman trying to make her way through life, struggling with bills, relationships, and her own personal demons. But to her mother, Mari Gilbert, Shannan was more than a statistic. She was her daughter, a fighter, and someone who deserved to be found. What began as a search for a single missing woman would grow into one of the most chilling criminal investigations in American history. The case of the Long Island serial killer, often shortened to LISK. Shannan's disappearance was not an isolated tragedy, but rather the thread that, when pulled, unraveled a much darker and longer story, one stretching back at least a decade. Who was Shannan Gilbert? Shannan was born in 1986 in upstate New York, raised in a working-class family that often struggled financially. Like many young women from similar backgrounds, she dreamed of something bigger, something better than what her small-town life had offered. But opportunities were limited. Shannan entered the world of escort work, advertising services on Craigslist and other online platforms, as many women did in the late 2000s. The internet had become both a tool of empowerment and a dangerous hunting ground. Friends and family described Shannan as bright, funny, and ambitious, though she carried a deep vulnerability. She wanted to escape poverty, to give her younger sisters a role model, and to someday build a stable life. Yet the path she took would ultimately lead her to a dangerous corner of Long Island, and into the center of a mystery still unfolding over a decade later. The night of May 1, 2010. Shannan had arranged to meet a client in Oak Beach, a gated community on Long Island's South Shore. Her driver, Michael Pack, had taken her to a residence rented by Joseph Brewer, one of her clients. At first, everything seemed typical of her work routine, but something happened inside that house, something we still don't fully understand. Shannan became panicked, frightened beyond reason. Around 4:51 a.m., she dialed 911. For 23 minutes, Shannan pleaded for help. On the call, she repeatedly said someone was after her, that they were trying to kill her. She fled Joseph Brewer's house, running into the dark streets of Oak Beach, banging on neighbors' doors, begging for help. One of those neighbors was Gus Colty, a retired insurance worker who saw Shannan, distressed and disoriented, screaming for help. Colty called 911 himself, but by the time police arrived, Shannan had disappeared into the marshlands bordering the neighborhood. Despite the frantic call and multiple witnesses who saw her terrified that night, police initially brushed off the case. They suggested Shannan was just another escort who had run away or was on drugs. Her family refused to accept that. Mari Gilbert's relentless fight. Enter Mari Gilbert, Shannan's mother. Unlike the police, Mari knew her daughter's life mattered. She wasn't going to let Shannan's case be swept aside because of her line of work. Mari demanded answers. She spoke to the media, pushed law enforcement to act, and rallied anyone who would listen. She refused to accept the dismissive explanations and insisted something much larger was at play. Mari's persistence was the spark that kept the case alive. Without her, it's possible Shannan's disappearance might never have led to what came next. December 2010, the first grim discovery. 7 months after Shannan went missing, Suffolk County Police began a more serious search of the area around Oak Beach and along Ocean Parkway, which stretches across Long Island's South Shore barrier islands. On December 11, 2010, police made a chilling discovery: human remains. Within days, more remains were found. By the end of that month, the bodies of 4 young women were identified. Melissa Bartholomew, 24. Maureen Brainerd Barnes, 25. Megan Waterman, 22. Amber Lynn Costello, 27. All were sex workers who had advertised services online, much like Shannan. They would later be known as the Gilgo Four, named after the beach where their remains were found. The connection was undeniable. Whoever had killed these women had likely lured them through the same websites Shannan had used. The killer knew the area, knew how to hide bodies, and was careful enough to avoid capture for years. The birth of the Long Island serial killer case. The discovery of the Gilgo Four transformed Shannan's disappearance from an isolated missing persons case into a serial murder investigation. Suddenly, Suffolk County Police weren't looking for just one woman, they were looking for a predator. The press quickly dubbed the unknown suspect the Long Island serial killer. Some called him the Gilgo Beach killer. Law enforcement quietly admitted that the number of victims could be higher. But here was the unsettling part. Shannan's body wasn't among those first four. She had vanished in May, and despite months of searching, she remained missing. The other four were found near Gilgo Beach, but Shannan's trail seemed to end in the Oak Beach marsh. Her case was linked to the others, but not identical. Media attention and public fear. As news of the Gilgo Four spread, the public grew terrified. Long Island was supposed to be a safe suburban haven. These weren't back alleys of New York City. It was the quiet, affluent neighborhoods of Suffolk County. The idea that a serial killer was roaming freely, targeting women, shook the community. Parents worried, local sex workers panicked, and the national media descended. The story hit a nerve because it wasn't just about murder. It was about class, gender, and how victims are treated. These women were escorts. They were from working-class families. To many, they were invisible until their bodies turned up in the sand. Lost girls, from book to film. The case caught the attention of Robert Kalker, a journalist who carefully documented the lives of the women involved and the failures of law enforcement. His 2013 book, Lost Girls, an unsolved American mystery, humanized the victims and exposed the systemic problems that allowed their disappearances to go unnoticed for so long. Later in 2020, the book was adapted into the Netflix film Lost Girls, directed by Liz Garbus and written by Michael Werwey. The film starred Amy Ryan as Mari Gilbert, portraying her as the relentless mother who refused to let her daughter be forgotten. Other cast members included Thomasin McKenzie, Lola Kirk, Una Lawrence, Dean Winters, Miriam Shore, Reed Birney, Kevin Corrigan, and Gabriel Bayan. The film premiered at the Sundance Film Festival on January 28, 2020, and was released on Netflix on March 13, 2020. It gave global audiences a dramatized look at the case, keeping the story alive in the public eye. Shannan's body is finally found. It wasn't until December 2011, more than a year after the Gilgo Four were discovered, that Shannan Gilbert's remains were finally found in the marsh near Oak Beach. Police claimed her death was accidental, that she had run into the marsh and drowned while under the influence, but her family never believed it. Mari Gilbert insisted her daughter was murdered and that her death was linked to the serial killer. The official cause of death remains disputed, but Shannan's disappearance was the key that unlocked the Long Island serial killer investigation, the Gilgo Four. The discovery of the first four bodies in December 2010 marked a turning point in the case. Before that, Shannan Gilbert's disappearance had been treated by many in law enforcement as just another missing person report involving a sex worker. Now, with multiple victims uncovered in the same stretch of beach, police could no longer dismiss the possibility of a predator operating on Long Island. The first woman to be identified was Melissa Bartholomew. She had vanished in July 2009 after leaving her Bronx apartment. Melissa was 24, close to her younger sister, and working as an escort to pay her bills and support her dream of becoming a hairdresser. After her disappearance, her younger sister Amanda began receiving chilling phone calls from a man using Melissa's phone. He taunted Amanda, mocked her, and even admitted to killing Melissa. The calls were traced to locations in Manhattan, near Times Square and Madison Square Garden, but the man on the line was never caught. Those calls became some of the earliest clues pointing to the methods of the Long Island serial killer. Next was Maureen Brainard Barnes, who had gone missing in 2007. At just 25 years old, Maureen had left her Connecticut home to take a train into New York City, telling her family she was going to spend the night with friends. Instead, she planned to meet clients she had arranged through Craigslist. That night was the last time anyone saw her alive. For years, her disappearance attracted little media attention. Her family was heartbroken, but with little evidence to go on, police considered her case low priority. The discovery of her remains 3 years later revealed the truth: she had been taken and discarded on Long Island by someone who had likely planned his crimes carefully. The third victim was Megan Waterman, just 22 years old and the mother of a young daughter. Megan had traveled from Maine to Long Island in June 2010 with her boyfriend. She was last seen leaving a Holiday Inn Express in Hauppauge, Long Island in the early hours of the morning. Megan, too, had advertised her services online. When she never returned, her family feared the worst. The pain of her loss was magnified by the fact that she had been a devoted mother, working in dangerous circumstances to provide for her child. Her daughter would grow up without her, another casualty of a killer who preyed on women society often overlooked. The fourth victim, Amber Lynn Costello, was 27. A spirited woman from North Babylon, New York, she had struggled with addiction but remained loved deeply by her family. On the night of September 2, 2010, she told her roommate she was heading out to meet a client. She never returned. Police later learned that the client had contacted her using a burner cell phone. That detail would prove important more than a decade later, when investigators finally linked those burner phones to a suspect. The Gilgo Four were different women from different backgrounds, but their lives intersected in tragic ways. Each one had been vulnerable, each one trying to survive, and each one had placed their trust in a stranger they met through Craigslist. Their bodies were found wrapped in burlap, carefully placed along Ocean Parkway, suggesting the killer had a method, a routine, and a territory he knew well. As police processed the crime scene, fear spread across Long Island. The quiet beaches where families once walked their dogs or watched the waves were now the backdrop to a serial murder investigation. Residents worried, and sex workers across New York panicked, knowing that someone out there was targeting women just like them. The press swarmed Gilgo Beach, reporting every new detail and giving the case a name: the Long Island serial killer. The discovery also reignited the search for Shannan Gilbert. Her family, particularly her mother Mari, pointed out that Shannan's disappearance had led police to this area in the first place. Mari insisted that her daughter's case was connected to the others, even as authorities publicly stated there was no definitive proof. Police suggested Shannan may have drowned accidentally in the marsh, but Mari refused to believe that. She was convinced her daughter had been murdered by the same man who killed the Gilgo Four. In early 2011, as investigators combed the area for more evidence, the case grew even darker. Additional human remains were discovered scattered along Ocean Parkway. These victims were not all killed in the same way as the Gilgo Four, but their presence suggested either one killer with varied methods or possibly more than one predator using the same dumping grounds. The remains included partial bodies that were later matched to women who had gone missing years earlier, some of them previously found in other parts of Long Island. The scope of the case widened dramatically. The FBI became involved, lending expertise in criminal profiling. Analysts began to piece together what kind of man they were looking for. He was likely familiar with the area, comfortable enough to transport and dispose of bodies without being seen. He may have lived locally or had professional reasons to be in Suffolk County. The use of burner phones suggested he was organized and cautious. The fact that he targeted sex workers who advertised online indicated he was exploiting a group of women he believed police and society would not protect. For the families of the victims, the sudden attention was bittersweet. On one hand, Their loved ones were finally being recognized in the media, and their cases taken seriously. On the other, they had to live with the horror of knowing their daughters and sisters had been preyed upon by someone who had calculated every move. Mari Gilbert emerged as a vocal advocate, speaking not only for Shannan, but for all the women whose lives had been cut short. She demanded accountability from law enforcement and criticized the way the victims had been portrayed. Too often, news reports reduced them to labels like prostitutes, instead of telling their full stories as daughters, mothers, and sisters. By the spring of 2011, Gilgo Beach had become synonymous with fear. The phrase "Long Island serial killer" appeared in headlines across the country. True crime fans dissected the case online, amateur sleuths proposed theories, and residents of Long Island struggled to reconcile their quiet suburban life with the reality that a serial killer had been operating undetected for years. And still, the biggest question remained unanswered: who was he, and why hadn't he been caught? The investigation was far from over. More bodies would be found, more theories would circulate, and more pressure would build on the Suffolk County Police Department to solve the mystery. But for now, the Gilgo Four stood as the most haunting evidence of the predator's work for young women, each searching for a better life, whose dreams ended in the sands of Long Island, expanding the burial ground. In March and April of 2011, the Suffolk County Police Department returned to the tangled brush and marshland along Ocean Parkway, armed with cadaver dogs, forensic experts, and search teams determined to see if the Gilgo Four were the only victims buried there. What they uncovered shocked even the most seasoned detectives. On March 29, officers found the skeletal remains of a woman several miles east of the original four bodies. This victim was later identified as Jessica Taylor, a 20-year-old from Manhattan who had gone missing in 2003. Jessica's case was already known to law enforcement. Part of her remains, including her torso, had been found years earlier in Manorville, a rural part of Long Island. Now, with more of her remains discovered near Gilgo Beach, a horrifying connection emerged. The killer, or killers, had dismembered Jessica and scattered her body parts in different locations, using both inland forests and the oceanfront to hide his crimes. Just a few days later, search teams discovered 3 more sets of remains. They belonged to a toddler, a woman later identified as the toddler's mother, and an unidentified man believed to be of Asian descent. The child was estimated to be around 2 years old, wrapped in a blanket. Investigators were stunned. Up until this point, the Long Island serial killer was believed to be targeting only young female sex workers. The discovery of a child and a man challenged that profile, raising disturbing new questions. Was this the work of the same killer, or had multiple killers been using the same stretch of Ocean Parkway as a dumping ground? The discoveries didn't stop there. On April 11, police found 3 more sets of remains, bringing the total number of victims in the Gilgo Beach case to 10. Among them were more body parts connected to women whose torsos had previously been discovered in Manorville in the early 2000s. Investigators concluded that at least 2 women, Jessica Taylor and another victim nicknamed Peaches, because of a distinctive peach-shaped tattoo, had been dismembered and scattered across multiple dump sites. The case had expanded from 4 victims to at least 10, and the full scope of the horror was becoming clear. As the body count grew, so did public fascination. News outlets from across the country camped out near Gilgo Beach, reporting live from Ocean Parkway. Helicopters hovered overhead while search crews combed through the brush. The grisly discoveries dominated headlines, and the phrase "Long Island serial killer" became a household term. For Long Island residents, the idea that their community had been used as a burial ground for a decade or more was chilling. Parents warned their daughters, and women working in the sex trade became more cautious, but fear alone couldn't stop the predator who had already claimed so many lives. Law enforcement, meanwhile, faced increasing criticism. Families of the victims accused police of dragging their feet and not taking missing persons reports seriously, particularly when those missing were sex workers. Mari Gilbert, Shannan's mother, was the most outspoken. She appeared on television, gave interviews, and organized vigils to keep the spotlight on the case. Mari believed Shannan's disappearance was directly tied to the other murders, and she refused to let her daughter's story be dismissed. The FBI officially joined the investigation, lending their behavioral analysis unit to build a profile of the killer. The profile suggested that the perpetrator was likely a white male in his 30s to 40s, familiar with the South Shore of Long Island, possibly married with children, and able to blend into suburban life without raising suspicion. He was organized, intelligent, and cautious, using prepaid burner phones to contact victims, disposing of bodies in isolated areas, and taking care to cover his tracks. Investigators believed he might have a background in construction, law enforcement, or another field that gave him both the knowledge of remote locations and the confidence to transport bodies without detection. Still, the investigation was plagued with problems. Suffolk County Police Chief James Burke, who took over in late 2011, made the controversial decision to cut the FBI out of the case, insisting his department could handle it alone. Burke's leadership would later come under scrutiny when he himself was arrested and convicted for assaulting a suspect and covering it up. His corruption cast a long shadow over the Gilgo Beach case, fueling suspicions that mishandling and incompetence had allowed the killer to remain free for so long. Despite the setbacks, police continued to search for answers. Forensic experts studied the burlap sacks used to wrap some of the bodies, hoping to trace fibers or manufacturers. Cell phone records were analyzed in depth, especially the burner phones used to contact Amber Costello and Melissa Bartholomew. Those records showed that the killer had been cautious, but not careless. He had made calls from areas in Manhattan and Massapequa Park, suggesting he moved between the city and suburban Long Island. Meanwhile, families of the victims struggled to piece their lives back together. Maureen Brainard Barnes's family in Connecticut, Megan Waterman's loved ones in Maine, and Amber Costello's relatives in New York all tried to process the grief of losing their daughters and sisters while also dealing with the stigma attached to their work. They fought to remind the world that these women were more than sex workers. They were mothers, daughters, and human beings who deserved justice. The case also exposed the vulnerability of sex workers in the age of the Internet. Craigslist, which had once been a booming platform for escort ads, came under fire for enabling predators to connect with victims anonymously. Advocates for sex worker safety pushed for reforms, better protections, and less stigmatization so that women could come forward about dangerous clients without fear of arrest or shame. But for the families of the Gilgo victims, those conversations felt like too little, too late. As months turned into years, the case grew colder. Police continued to receive tips, but no arrests were made. Theories multiplied. Some believed there was a single Long Island serial killer responsible for all 10 victims. Others argued that multiple killers had used the same dumping grounds, pointing to the differences in victim types and methods of disposal. The dismemberment of Jessica Taylor and Peaches seemed inconsistent with the burlap-wrapped Gilgo Four. The toddler and unidentified Asian male victim further complicated the profile. It was possible, some experts suggested, that Gilgo Beach had become a convenient disposal site for more than one predator over the years. The uncertainty only added to the frustration of the families. Each year, they gathered for memorials along Ocean Parkway, leaving flowers, candles, and photos of their loved ones. Mari Gilbert continued to fight, filing lawsuits, pressuring police, and refusing to let Shannan's case be forgotten. She believed that solving the Gilgo murders would ultimately reveal the truth about what happened to her daughter. For the general public, the Gilgo Beach case became one of the most infamous unsolved mysteries of the 2010s. Documentaries, podcasts, and true crime specials kept the story alive. The victims were nicknamed, theories were debated online, and the Long Island serial killer became a ghostly figure haunting American crime lore. And yet, despite the attention, the killer remained free, hidden in plain sight, perhaps living an ordinary life while families mourned and investigators stumbled. By 2012, the case had officially stalled. Police insisted they were making progress, but no suspects were named, no arrests were made, and no new leads seemed to surface publicly. The beaches grew quiet again, but the scars remained. Gilgo Beach was no longer just a place for sun and sand, it was a graveyard, a reminder of the lives lost and the justice still denied. The unanswered questions piled up. Why did the killer stop, or had he stopped at all? Could there be more bodies hidden along Long Island's coast, waiting to be found? Was Shannan Gilbert truly a victim of the same killer, or was her death an unrelated tragedy? Each question fueled speculation, and each year without resolution deepened the mystery. The investigation would eventually stretch on for more than a decade, spanning multiple police chiefs, countless detectives, and endless speculation. But for the families of the victims, time didn't heal the wounds. Every holiday, every birthday, every milestone missed was a reminder of what had been stolen by a faceless predator. They held on to hope, but hope alone could not bring answers. The search for Shannan Gilbert. While the Gilgo Four and the other bodies uncovered in 2011 dominated headlines, the family of Shannan Gilbert never stopped demanding that her case remain at the center of the investigation. It was Shannan, after all, who had vanished first and whose disappearance had led police to Gilgo Beach in the first place. To Mari Gilbert, Shannan's mother, her daughter was not just a name among many. She was the key to understanding the entire case. Mari insisted again and again that Shannan's death was tied to the Long Island serial killer, even as authorities hesitated to make that connection. The search for Shannan stretched on for more than a year. In May 2010, the night she disappeared, Shannan had been hired by a client in Oak Beach, a quiet, gated community near Gilgo. She arrived at the home of Joseph Brewer, a middle-aged man who admitted he had hired her for the night. Shannan also brought along her driver and sometimes bodyguard, Michael Pack, who waited in the car while she went inside. Something went wrong not long after. Around 4:51 a.m., Shannan made a frantic 911 call that lasted more than 20 minutes. She told the dispatcher that they're trying to kill me before running from Brewer's home in a panic. Neighbors later reported seeing her banging on doors and screaming for help. But when Pack tried to get her back into his car, she refused. She ran off into the marshland, never to be seen alive again. That phone call became one of the most haunting pieces of evidence in the case. For more than a decade, the full recording was never released to the public. Even her family only heard fragments of it. But what was clear from the parts that were made known was that Shannan was terrified and convinced her life was in danger. Despite this, police initially suggested she had simply become disoriented, wandered into the marsh, and drowned. To Mari Gilbert, that explanation made no sense. Her daughter was young, healthy, and desperate to get away from whoever scared her. Mari argued that the killer chased her that night and that her death was anything but accidental. For 18 months, search teams scoured the Oak Beach area, cutting through thick reeds and muddy terrain. The marshland was difficult to navigate, with knee-deep water and sharp grasses that made every search dangerous. Time and again, searches turned up nothing, but Mari would not stop pushing. She attended community meetings, organized vigils, and used every media appearance she could to remind the world that Shannan's case remained unsolved. On December 13, 2011, searchers finally made a grim discovery. Just half a mile from where she had last been seen, in a tangled marsh near Oak Beach, they found skeletal remains. Dental records later confirmed they belonged to Shannan Gilbert. Alongside her remains, searchers found some of her belongings, a purse, jeans, and shoes scattered nearby. To Suffolk County Police, the discovery seemed to support their theory that Shannan had become disoriented, stripped off her clothes in the cold, and drowned in the marsh. But her family rejected that conclusion. Mari Gilbert spoke out publicly, saying her daughter had been murdered. Her lawyer, John Ray, echoed her stance, insisting that Shannan's 911 call was a desperate attempt to escape an attacker. He criticized the police for downplaying her case and for being slow to act from the very beginning. Ray argued that Shannan's death fit a clear pattern with the other victims: the same age range, the same occupation, and the same disposal site. To him and Mari, dismissing Shannan as an accidental drowning was not only insulting, but also dangerous, because it allowed a serial killer to continue operating without accountability. The controversy over Shannan's death deepened when her autopsy report came back inconclusive. The Suffolk County medical examiner stated that there was no clear evidence of homicide, but neither was there definitive proof of accidental drowning. The marshland where she was found made it difficult to determine exactly how she had died. Later, an independent autopsy commissioned by the Gilbert family suggested possible signs of strangulation, though the evidence was not strong enough to be conclusive. For Mari, however, that was enough to convince her that Shannan had been murdered. The battle between Mari and law enforcement played out in the media, with both sides standing firm. Police insisted they had no proof linking Shannan to the Long Island serial killer, while Mari accused them of protecting their own reputation at the expense of justice. The disagreement highlighted the mistrust many families of the victims felt toward Suffolk County Police. They believed that if the victims had been from wealthier neighborhoods, or if they had not been sex workers, the cases would have been treated with more urgency. Meanwhile, the release of Lost Girls, an unsolved American mystery by journalist Robert Kalker in 2013, gave the victims a new voice. The book, which later inspired the Netflix film, focused on the lives of the women themselves rather than just the killer. Kalker told the stories of Maureen, Melissa, Megan, Amber, and Shannan, showing their humanity and the struggles they faced. The book painted a picture not of faceless victims, but of women trying to navigate a world stacked against them, who ultimately fell prey to someone who saw them as disposable. The book reignited public interest in the case, but it did not bring answers. As the years dragged on, frustration mounted. The Suffolk County Police Department faced leadership scandals, including the arrest of Chief James Burke in 2015 for beating a suspect and orchestrating a cover-up. His downfall further eroded public trust and fueled speculation that corruption had hampered the investigation into the Long Island serial killer. Some even speculated, without evidence, that Burke himself might have been connected to the crimes. Though those rumors were dismissed, the damage to the department's reputation was undeniable. Through it all, Mari Gilbert never stopped fighting. She appeared on television specials, gave interviews, and stood at vigils, demanding answers not only for Shannan but for all of the victims. She became a symbol of persistence in the face of tragedy, but Mari's story ended in tragedy of its own. In 2016, she was murdered by her younger daughter, Sarah, who suffered from severe mental illness. Years of silence. After the dramatic discoveries of 2010 and 2011, the investigation into the Long Island serial killer slowed to a crawl. Detectives had collected bodies, examined cell phone records, interviewed witnesses, and brought in the FBI, yet no arrests were made and no solid suspect emerged. For the families of the victims, the long years that followed were some of the most painful. Each day that passed without answers felt like justice slipping further away. By 2012, official announcements about the case grew rare. Suffolk County Police issued periodic updates, but most of them were vague, offering no real progress. The department insisted the case was active and ongoing, yet to the families and the public, it seemed as if the momentum had been lost. The beaches grew quiet again, the cameras went away, and the haunting stretch of Ocean Parkway receded from the headlines. Still, the victims were not forgotten. Families organized vigils each year, laying flowers near Gilgo Beach and reading the names of their daughters and sisters aloud. Activists and advocates used these gatherings to demand more transparency from police. Mari Gilbert remained a tireless voice for justice, often standing alone against a wall of bureaucracy. Even after her tragic murder in 2016, her fight lived on through her surviving daughters and the growing community of people determined to keep the case alive. The silence of the investigation created space for speculation. Online forums buzzed with theories. Amateur sleuths pored over maps, phone records, and timelines, comparing the Gilgo murders to other unsolved cases in the region. Some believed the killer had ties to law enforcement, pointing to the strange decision by Chief James Burke to cut the FBI out of the case. Others suspected multiple killers, citing the differences between the Gilgo Four and the dismembered victims from Manorville. Conspiracy theories flourished. Had police ignored leads to protect one of their own? Was the killer connected to organized crime? Or was he simply an ordinary man who knew the landscape well enough to hide in plain sight? Documentaries and true crime shows picked up the case, each offering their own take. Investigators who appeared on camera often emphasized how difficult the case was, the lack of eyewitnesses, the transient nature of sex work, the careful use of burner phones by the killer. These explanations, while true, did little to ease the frustration of the families. To them, the excuses sounded like failures. They wanted results, not reasons. The stigma surrounding the victims continued to cast a shadow over the case. Many of the women had been dismissed by police when they were first reported missing, their families told that they might have simply run away or started new lives. Only when their bodies were discovered together did authorities treat their disappearances with urgency. This pattern, of society valuing some victims less than others, was not new, but in the Gilgo Beach case it became impossible to ignore. Advocates for sex workers argued that the tragedy could have been prevented if law enforcement had taken the women's disappearances seriously from the start. In 2015, the case gained renewed attention when Chief James Burke was arrested for brutally assaulting a man who had stolen personal items from his vehicle, then orchestrating a cover-up. His downfall painted a grim picture of corruption within the Suffolk County Police Department. Critics argued that if the chief himself had been involved in misconduct, it was no wonder the Gilgo Beach case had gone nowhere. Some even speculated that Burke had actively obstructed the investigation to hide connections, though no evidence ever proved that theory. Still, his removal gave families a small glimmer of hope that new leadership might finally push the case forward. Forensic technology advanced during those years, and investigators quietly re-examined the evidence with new tools. DNA analysis improved, databases expanded, and methods of tracking cell phone pings became more precise. Every so often, Suffolk County Police hinted that new information was being processed, but nothing concrete emerged. The case seemed locked in a holding pattern, a puzzle missing a final piece. Shannan Gilbert's case remained especially controversial. Her 911 call, still largely withheld from the public, was at the heart of debates over whether she had been murdered or not. Her family continued to argue that she was the first known victim of the Long Island serial killer, while police maintained that her death might have been unrelated. The uncertainty fueled endless speculation and kept the spotlight on the Suffolk County Police Department's credibility. Meanwhile, the story of the Long Island serial killer became part of American true crime culture. Podcasts dissected every detail, YouTube videos mapped out theories, and Reddit threads debated endlessly about suspects. Some amateur sleuths zeroed in on local residents of Oak Beach, including men who had hosted parties and seemed suspicious. Others looked at former law enforcement officers with connections to the area. Still others believed the killer might have been a truck driver or someone whose job required frequent travel between Manhattan and Long Island. The theories were endless, but without hard evidence, they remained just speculation. In 2020, the case returned to public consciousness in a major way when Netflix released Lost Girls, the film adaptation of Robert Kalker's book. The movie focused on Mari Gilbert's fight for justice and the human stories of the victims. Amy Ryan's portrayal of Mari captured her relentless determination, while the film as a whole highlighted the indifference the families often faced from authorities. Though the film did not offer new evidence or answers, it reignited public interest and introduced the case to millions of viewers around the world. The renewed attention also put pressure back on Suffolk County officials. In January 2020, investigators released previously unseen evidence, including photographs of a belt with an inscription believed to belong to the killer. They hoped the release would generate new leads, but nothing definitive came of it. Still, the move signaled that police were finally willing to share more with the public, a sharp contrast to the years of silence that had frustrated families. As 2021 and 2022 passed, the case seemed once again on the verge of fading into obscurity. Then, in 2022, Suffolk County District Attorney Ray Tierney and a new task force announced a fresh push into the investigation. They re-examined old evidence with modern forensic techniques, mapped out cell phone tower data in greater detail, and followed up on overlooked leads. For the first time in years, there was a sense of movement. The families cautiously allowed themselves to hope again. Behind the scenes, investigators were zeroing in on something they had missed before. The burner phones used by the killer to contact victims and taunt family members had always been a critical clue. Now, with better technology and a renewed focus, detectives were able to narrow down the possible users of those phones to specific locations and timeframes. One name began to emerge, quietly at first but with increasing certainty, a name that would change everything in 2023 closing in. The creation of the Gilgo Beach Homicide Task Force in early 2022 marked a turning point. For years, the case had felt stagnant, weighed down by corruption, internal politics, and lack of transparency. But with new leadership, Suffolk County District Attorney Ray Tierney, along with officials from the New York State Police, Suffolk County Sheriff's Office, and the FBI, the atmosphere shifted. There was fresh energy, a sense of urgency that hadn't been seen since the bodies were first discovered more than a decade earlier. The task force started by going back to basics. Every piece of evidence collected since 2010 was re-examined. Thousands of pages of records were scanned again. Crime scene photos, autopsy reports, and witness interviews were revisited. They mapped out the victims' movements in painstaking detail, cross-referencing timelines with cell tower pings and known phone numbers. Investigators weren't just looking for new evidence. They were searching for patterns that might have been missed the first time around. One of the most important pieces of the puzzle was the burner phones used by the killer. Back in 2010 and 2011, investigators knew the phones existed but lacked the advanced tools to track them with precision. By 2022, cell site location data had become far more sophisticated. Analysts were able to overlay the movements of the burner phones against the geography of Long Island, focusing on times when the killer contacted victims or taunted their families. The results were striking. The phones consistently pinged near Massapequa Park, a quiet suburban neighborhood in Nassau County. Investigators began to look more closely at residents of the area, who lived there during the time of the murders, who matched the behavioral profile of the killer, a man with enough knowledge of the South Shore barrier island to dispose of bodies without being seen, and enough resources to maintain burner phones while living a seemingly normal life. At the same time, forensic advances allowed new analysis of hair and fiber evidence. Early tests had been inconclusive, but improved DNA technology gave the task force a chance to recheck samples recovered from burlap sacks that had been used to wrap several of the Gilgo Four. Those tests yielded critical results, hairs that did not belong to the victims. Some belonged to a man, others to a woman. Though degraded, they were enough to be compared against new DNA databases. As the months went by, a clearer picture started to form. A suspect was emerging, though the task force kept their work tightly sealed. Behind closed doors, they began surveillance, quietly following the man they believed could be the Long Island serial killer. That man was Rex Heuermann, a 59-year-old architect who lived in Massapequa Park, less than a half-hour drive from Gilgo Beach. On the surface, Heuermann seemed like a normal suburban professional. He was married, had children, and ran a Manhattan-based architecture firm that catered to corporate clients. Neighbors described him as quiet, though some noted he had an odd or intimidating presence. To investigators, however, his life didn't look so ordinary. The cell phone records placed him in critical areas at critical times. His physical description matched witness accounts from escorts who had been contacted but survived, and the DNA evidence from the burlap bags was beginning to line up with his household. In early 2023, the task force discreetly collected discarded items from Heuermann's trash. On one of them, a pizza crust, they found a DNA profile that matched the male hair discovered on the victims. This was the breakthrough investigators had been waiting for. But even with DNA, phone records, and geographic ties, the task force moved cautiously. They knew the history of this case, how fragile public trust had become after years of failed leads and false promises. They needed to be absolutely certain before moving forward. Surveillance on Heuermann intensified. Detectives tracked his daily routines, his work commute, his interactions with neighbors and family. They monitored his online activity and dug into his digital footprint. What they found was chilling. Heuermann had allegedly searched obsessively for news coverage of the Gilgo Beach murders. He looked up images of the victims, studied serial killer documentaries, and browsed violent pornography sites. To investigators, this digital trail painted a disturbing portrait of a man fixated on the very crimes he was suspected of committing. The closer they looked, the darker the picture became. Interviews with women who had encountered Heuermann through sex work described encounters that were controlling, aggressive, and frightening. Some said he pushed boundaries and seemed to relish having power over them. Though these accounts didn't all rise to the level of criminal charges, they strengthened the impression that investigators were dealing with a predator who hid in plain sight. By the spring of 2023, the task force felt they had enough to move. The evidence wasn't perfect. There were still gaps, unanswered questions, and uncertainties about the full number of victims, but it was strong enough to bring charges in at least 3 of the Gilgo Four cases. Plans for the arrest began in earnest. On July 13, 2023, Suffolk County detectives and New York State police officers quietly surrounded Massapequa Park. When Rex Heuermann stepped out of his Manhattan office that evening, plainclothes officers closed in. After more than a decade of frustration, dead ends, and unanswered questions, the man believed to be the Long Island serial killer was in custody. The arrest sent shockwaves across Long Island and the country. News crews swarmed Massapequa Park, where Heuermann's modest home was quickly surrounded by yellow police tape. Investigators began an exhaustive search of the property, hauling out boxes of evidence, digging through the backyard, even dismantling walls inside the house. Neighbors watched in disbelief as their quiet street became the center of one of America's most infamous true crime stories. Heuermann was charged with the murders of Melissa Barthelemy, Megan Waterman, and Amber Costello, 3 of the Gilgo Four. Prosecutors also identified him as the prime suspect in the murder of Maureen Brainard Barnes, the 4th of the group, though charges in that case were still pending. For the families, the arrest was both a relief and a reopening of old wounds. Some cried tears of joy, grateful that someone was finally being held accountable. Others expressed anger that it had taken so long, that their loved ones' cases had been neglected for years while the killer continued living his life. Still, the moment marked a milestone. After more than a decade of darkness, there was finally light. Investigators made clear that the arrest did not close the book on the Gilgo Beach murders. Many victims remained unidentified, and several cases, including Shannan Gilbert's, were still unresolved. But for the first time, there was real progress, real accountability, and real hope that the truth was within reach. The world now knew the name Rex Heuermann. The question that remained was whether he was the sole killer behind all the bodies found along Ocean Parkway, or just one piece of a larger, more complicated mystery. the arrest heard around the world. The arrest of Rex Heuermann on July 14, 2023, was more than just another development in a long, cold case. It was an earthquake that shook the community of Long Island, stunned the families of the victims, and captivated a nation that had been following the Gilgo Beach mystery for more than a decade. News outlets across the United States broke into their regular programming to carry the story live. By nightfall, cable news channels, local stations, podcasts, and social media feeds were consumed with one question: had the Long Island serial killer finally been caught? In Massapequa Park, the quiet suburban neighborhood where Heuermann had lived for decades, the scene was surreal. Dozens of police vehicles lined the streets as investigators executed search warrants at his home. Neighbors stood in clusters on their lawns, some crying, some whispering in disbelief, others holding up cell phones to record what felt like the climax of a true crime movie playing out in real time. Children who once walked past the Heuermann home on their way to school were now told to stay inside as crime scene technicians erected tents and hauled evidence out in cardboard boxes. The house itself was a far cry from the man's professional image. In Manhattan, Heuermann presented himself as a meticulous architect, a man who wore suits, carried portfolios, and spoke in the polished tone of a business professional. But the home in Massapequa Park looked neglected, with peeling paint, clutter in the yard, and a reputation among neighbors as the creepy house on the block. As authorities searched every inch of the property, they removed safes, computers, firearms, and what appeared to be stacks of disturbing material. For many, the contrast between Heuermann's double life, suburban family man and suspected predator, was chilling. At his first court appearance, Heuermann looked nothing like the polished professional he once projected. Wearing a wrinkled polo shirt, unshaven and visibly shaken, he listened as prosecutors laid out the evidence against him. The DNA match from the pizza crust, the cell phone data linking him to burner phones, the witness descriptions that lined up with his appearance, all of it painted a damning picture. When the judge read out the charges for the murders of Melissa Barthelemy, Megan Waterman, and Amber Costello, the courtroom fell into heavy silence. For the families, hearing their daughters' names attached to formal charges was both painful and validating. The press coverage was relentless. Every new detail from court documents became headline news. The New York Times, the Washington Post, and local outlets like Newsday ran long features examining Heuermann's background. Cable networks like CNN, Fox News, and MSNBC hosted nightly panels of former FBI agents, criminologists, and legal analysts dissecting what the arrest meant. True crime podcasts produced emergency episodes, poring over the evidence and speculating about the trial to come. The families of the victims were thrust back into the spotlight. Mari Gilbert, Shannan's mother, had tragically been murdered by another daughter years earlier and wasn't alive to see the arrest, but her surviving family members spoke out, saying Mari would have felt vindicated. The families of the Gilgo Four expressed a mix of emotions. Some were relieved that, at last, there was accountability. Others were angry that it had taken so long, pointing out that the killer had lived freely in their own backyard, while their loved ones were denied justice. Prosecutors emphasized that the investigation was still ongoing. While Heuermann faced charges in 3 murders and was the prime suspect in a 4th, there were at least 6 other victims whose cases remained unsolved. The body count discovered along Ocean Parkway could not be ignored, and investigators made it clear they were not ruling out the possibility of additional charges. Some law enforcement officials suggested Heuermann could be tied to other unsolved crimes across the region, though they were careful not to overstate until evidence was confirmed. In the public imagination, the arrest brought both clarity and confusion. On the one hand, it finally put a name and face to a mystery that had lingered for more than a decade. On the other, it raised new questions. Was Heuermann responsible for all of the bodies found near Gilgo Beach, or were multiple killers involved? Why had it taken so long to make an arrest when evidence had been available for years? Was corruption or incompetence inside the Suffolk County Police Department partly to blame for the delays? These questions fueled speculation across true crime communities. Online forums like Reddit exploded with theories, and YouTube channels dedicated to crime analysis racked up millions of views as amateur sleuths debated the evidence. Documentarians rushed to update their projects, while Netflix, which had released Lost Girls in 2020, was rumored to be considering a follow-up to capture the real-life developments. Meanwhile, investigators continued their search of Heuermann's home and office. Reports surfaced that they had seized hundreds of firearms, many unregistered, as well as disturbing online searches related to torture, violence, and serial killers. The sheer volume of digital evidence, computers, hard drives, and cloud accounts, was so large that prosecutors admitted it could take months, even years, to process. The task force also looked into Heuermann's travel history, checking whether he had ties to other unsolved murders across the United States. For the victims' families, the arrest provided a long-awaited chance to confront the man accused of destroying their lives. At vigils and press conferences, they spoke openly about their loved ones, not just as victims, but as daughters, mothers, sisters, and friends who had dreams and hopes before their lives were cut short. They reminded the public that the women were not defined by the labels society had placed on them as sex workers, but by the love they had given to their families. As summer turned to fall in 2023, the case against Heuermann began moving toward trial. His defense attorneys insisted that he was innocent, calling the DNA evidence circumstantial and criticizing the prosecution's reliance on cell phone records. They argued that Heuermann was being framed by overzealous investigators eager to close a high-profile case. Legal experts predicted a long, drawn-out battle in court, with prosecutors needing to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that Heuermann was the killer of the Gilgo Four. The community of Long Island braced for what was to come. Some residents expressed relief that a suspect was finally behind bars. Others admitted unease, knowing the story was far from over. For years, Gilgo Beach had been associated with mystery and fear. Even with an arrest, that shadow lingered. People still jogged past the dunes where bodies had been found, but the landscape was forever haunted by the knowledge of what had happened there. Nationally, the case reignited conversations about how society views sex workers. Advocates pointed out that if the victims had been from wealthier backgrounds, the response might have been swifter and more determined. The fact that it took more than a decade to bring charges against a man who lived openly in a nearby community was, for many, a damning indictment of systemic bias. Journalists and scholars began framing the story as not just a crime saga, but a reflection of deeper inequalities in American society. As the pretrial hearings began, prosecutors laid out a timeline of Heuermann's alleged actions. They described how he had used burner phones to arrange meetings, how he had studied his victims online, and how he had methodically transported their bodies to Gilgo Beach. They emphasized the cold, calculated nature of the crimes. Each detail horrified the public anew, a reminder of the brutality that had taken place in a setting that was supposed to be safe and ordinary. For all the attention, one mystery remained stubbornly unresolved: the death of Shannan Gilbert. Officials maintained that her death was accidental, the result of disorientation in the marshes after running from her client's home. But her family and supporters argued that it was connected to the larger pattern, that she was another victim of the killer who had terrorized Long Island. With Heuermann now in custody, some hoped the truth about Shannan would finally come to light. By the end of 2023, the Long Island serial killer case had become one of the most significant crime stories of the century. It was a story of tragedy and loss, but also of persistence, the persistence of families who refused to be silenced, of journalists who kept digging, and of investigators who eventually brought the pieces together. For the first time in more than a decade, the phrase "unsolved mystery" was no longer the only way to describe the Gilgo Beach murders. There was now a suspect, a trial ahead, and the hope that justice might finally be served. Legacy of the Lost Girls. The arrest of Rex Heuermann didn't end the story of the Gilgo Beach murders. It began a new chapter. As prosecutors prepared for trial, the case entered the slow and meticulous stage of the American justice system. Pretrial motions, evidentiary hearings, and jury selection loomed on the horizon. Prosecutors were determined to present an airtight case. They emphasized the DNA recovered from the burlap, the cell phone records tracing burner phones back to Heuermann's home and office, and the damning internet searches and disturbing content seized from his computers. Every piece of evidence was carefully cataloged, knowing that defense attorneys would attack each detail, each connection, each scientific test. The defense, meanwhile, signaled they would fight aggressively. They portrayed Heuermann as a convenient scapegoat, arguing that investigators had jumped at the first viable suspect after years of failure. They questioned the chain of custody on DNA samples and suggested that contaminated evidence could have led to false matches. They also hinted that others might be responsible for the additional bodies found along Ocean Parkway, subtly planting the idea of multiple killers in the jurors' minds. To them, Heuermann was not the monster the media had created, but an ordinary man caught in the crosshairs of a desperate task force. For the families, the coming trial was both dreaded and necessary. They braced themselves to sit through testimony about their daughter's final days, to hear details about how they were contacted, how they vanished, and how their bodies were discarded in the marshlands. Yet they also recognized that this was the only path to accountability. Some family members said they would attend every hearing. Others admitted the pain was too great and preferred to grieve privately. Still, they shared the hope that justice, even delayed, might finally arrive. Beyond the courtroom, the story continued to resonate. True crime documentaries proliferated, each trying to capture the essence of the mystery and the breakthrough. Podcasts dissected court filings in real time, while news outlets tracked every development with breathless intensity. Netflix's Lost Girls saw a resurgence in views, with new audiences discovering the dramatization of Mari Gilbert's fight for truth. And with Heuermann's arrest, Hollywood began circling the case again, considering new films or series that could dramatize the shocking double life of a man accused of being one of America's most elusive killers. But the most profound legacy wasn't on screen. It was in how the case forced Americans to confront uncomfortable truths. The Gilgo Beach victims were young women who lived on the margins of society. Many had turned to sex work out of financial need, often struggling with poverty, addiction, or difficult family situations. For years, those circumstances made it easy for authorities and the public to dismiss them. The phrase high-risk lifestyle was used repeatedly, as though the victims bore responsibility for their own deaths. Families pushed back, demanding that their daughters be remembered not as statistics, but as human beings who loved and were loved. This cultural reckoning reshaped conversations around sex work and law enforcement priorities. Advocates argued that the lives of women like the Gilgo Four should never have been treated as disposable. If the police had taken their disappearances more seriously from the start, perhaps the killings could have been stopped sooner. The Lost Girls case became a rallying cry for change, a reminder that justice cannot be selective, that every victim matters. Even with Heuermann in custody, the mysteries remained. Who were the unidentified victims found near Gilgo Beach, the women whose remains still had no names? Were they also connected to Heuermann or to someone else entirely? What about Shannan Gilbert? Was her death truly an accident? Or was she another victim of the killer? These unanswered questions kept the case alive, ensuring it would never fade completely into history. In Long Island, the physical landscape of the crime remained unchanged. Gilgo Beach still drew visitors, with families sunbathing and fishermen casting lines just yards from the dunes where bodies had been hidden. But to locals, the place would never be the same. Ocean Parkway had become synonymous with horror, a road forever linked with tragedy. The once idyllic stretch of barrier islands now carried a shadow, a reminder of the darkness that had festered beneath its beauty. The task force, even after Heuermann's arrest, vowed to keep working. They combed through tips, reviewed cold cases across the region, and continued to process the mountain of evidence collected from Heuermann's home and office. Federal authorities explored whether he might be linked to disappearances in other states. Detectives quietly wondered if there were victims they hadn't found yet. The specter of unfinished business hung over the case. For Mari Gilbert's surviving family, the bittersweet reality was undeniable. Mari had dedicated her life to keeping the case alive, to forcing authorities and the public to see the humanity of her daughter and the other victims. She had fought relentlessly, only to be killed by another daughter during a mental health crisis in 2016. She never lived to see the moment when a suspect was finally charged. But those who knew her said Mari's spirit hovered over the case, that the breakthrough would not have come without her persistence. As 2024 approached, the Gilgo Beach case entered its final stage, the long, uncertain road to trial. Whether or not Rex Heuermann was ultimately convicted, the story of the lost girls had already left its mark. It was a story of tragedy, yes, but also one of resilience. Families who refused to be silenced, journalists who kept digging, investigators who eventually found a way forward, all played a role in ensuring the women were not forgotten.